It was critical for immigrants coming west along the California Trail to reach the eastern side of the Sierra Mountains before winter set in. The infamous Donner Party wagon train of 1846 arrived late in August at the eastern base of the Sierras because they were misled about a shortcut called Hastings Cutoff. The harsh winter snows of the high altitudes were early that year, and they were accompanied by unusually heavy and prolonged snowfall, blocking passage through the mountains down into California. The Donner Party wagon train of 81 people ran out of food, and only 48 members of the party made it into California alive. The other 33 people died in the mountains, mostly due to hunger and the harsh weather. 21 of those who died were cannibalized by the survivors. 2 Indians who came up from the California side in the first of 3 rescue parties sent from Fort Sutter were the only people who were murdered for food. Patrick Breen kept a diary of the 5-month ordeal. He came down the mountain on April 29th with the last rescue party sent from the western side. Several weeks later, on June 22nd, most of the remnants of the Donner Party campsites were torched, and the cadavered corpses were buried in a mass grave by horrified members of the famed Mormon Battalion as they traveled east towards the Salt Lake Basin. It was 1851. Ina Coolbrith was 11 years old when her family's wagon train of 17 rusty schooners had been traveling for months in the long trek from Missouri. Jim Beckworth rode slowly ahead of the column. Beckworth made a point of knowing each family and group that joined his wagon train. He knew enough about people to know that it was a long journey and that harmony amongst the travelers was a key factor to a successful trip. He knew on the maiden trip, for example, the Pickett family secret that Mrs. Pickett was, in fact, Agnes Morton Coolbrith Smith, the widow of Don Carlos Smith and former plural wife of Joseph Smith, Jr., the founder and leader of the Mormon Church. Don Carlos died of malaria at 25 years old in 1841 and was a missionary and youngest brother of Joseph Smith, Jr., who was murdered in 1844. The Pickett family was haunted by stories of the Donner Party fiasco 5 years before. When near the pass, Jim asked Mrs. Pickett if her younger daughter would like to ride with him. She would then be the first white child to do so into California. More than 6 decades later, in 1915, at the Panama Pacific International Exposition in San Francisco, Ina Coolbrith was the president of the Congress of Authors and Journalists. 4,000 of the world's most well-known writers and journalists were invited to a luncheon where she was being honored as the long-crowned poet of California. Ina Coolbrith remembered Beckworth and her experience.
Ours was the first of the covered wagon trains to break the trail through Beckworth Pass into California. We were guided by the famous scout, Jim Beckworth, who is an historical figure and, to my mind, one of the most beautiful creatures that ever lived. He was rather dark and wore his hair in 2 long braids, twisted with colored cord that gave him a picturesque appearance. He wore a leather coat and moccasins, and rode his horse without a saddle. When we made that long journey toward the west over the deserts and mountains, our wagon train was driven over ground without a single mark of a wagon wheel until it was broken by ours. And when Jim Beckworth said he would like to have my mother's little girl ride into California on his horse in front of him, I was the happiest little girl in the world.
At the pass, Beckworth dismounted and helped the girl off the horse. An autumn wind had come up, stinging their faces, whipping their clothes. Storm clouds were gathering, darkening all the landscape except the valley lying to the west below them. The sun lighted it as if on purpose for this moment. Jim pointed to the glowing valley lying against a range of blue. "There, little girl," he said. "There is California. There is your kingdom." Ina Colbrith never publicly divulged the secret that Joseph Smith was her uncle, nor did Jim Beckworth.